Grim morning, and welcome to the Grim. I'm your host, Kristen. On today's episode, we'll be opening the gate and entering Charter Street Cemetery, located in Salem, Massachusetts. So grab your favorite mug, cozy up, and let's take a dig into history. After grueling hot summers, when the fresh, crisp air finally hits, Halloween enthusiasts head their way to Salem for some spellbound fun. It's the time of year when New England sees tourists rushing in, none more so than Salem, Massachusetts. Famously known for the wrong reasons, it's hard not to know the tales of the Salem Witch Trials. The golden red leaves and historic colonial homes surround an old stone-walled cemetery in the center of Salem. Originally known as Old Burial Point, it's now renamed Charter Street Cemetery. The cemetery dates back from 1637, with 485 headstones and around 600 residents. The final number buried, due to not all the graves having headstones, is unknown, but an estimation. Salem was one of the founding cities of America, but the quick craze of accusations for witchcraft, or witch hysteria, persecution, and death sentences overshadow the rest of its history. Of the hundreds of accusations of witchcraft around New England, Salem is the most historically known. Now more of a Halloween haven than a historical destination, the city fully embraced its witch trial history. Tourists might find themselves on city walking tours, ghost hunts, or in one of the many city's witch-themed shops buying trinkets. Yet the real question is, how did a group fleeing religious persecution from one establishment find themselves committing the same acts against their own? Salem found itself in a unique situation in the 1600s, and in the middle of establishing a new colony. A group of preteen girls used witch hysteria to their advantage. By accusing their own neighbors for varied personal reasons of being in league with the devil, and inflicting harm to them using skills of so-called witchcraft. But how is Charter Street Cemetery and the witch trials connected, with no witches buried on the grounds? Located right outside the cemetery is the Salem Witch Trials Memorial. Due to the accused being guilty of witchcraft and in league with the devil, they were no longer allowed to be buried on consecrated land, making it impossible for any of them to be laid to rest in Charter Street Cemetery or any other local graveyard in Salem. Families of the accused have private burials under darkness, lost to history, but the memorial is the best place to remember their grim fates. Happily right outside the gates of their prosecutor's grave, every fall millions pay their respect to the wrongly accused. Each of the witches are listed in stone, by name, with their year of execution and how they met their grim fate. With the overcrowded streets of Salem during Halloween, the memorial is a solemn place, filled with tourists realizing the reality of the Salem Witch Trials. That it's all not just a bunch of hocus pocus in the witch city. Upon entering the grounds, you are quickly met by Judge John Hawthorne. Known to locals as the hanging judge, judges during this time were supposed to assist the accused in defense and guarantee a fair trial. Hawthorne didn't. He famously was known for his harsh questioning and biased views in the trial, even going as far to overturning the acquittal of Rebecca Nurse and convincing the jury to a guilty verdict. After years passed, most of all those involved had guilty consciences of the deaths and treatment they caused to the innocent victims. Hawthorne, however, didn't. Even on his deathbed, he never repented, felt differently of his actions, or of the trial's outcomes. Hawthorne's great-great-grandson is the famous American author Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne's shame in his family's actions and partake in the trials created the catalyst for him to add the letter W to his last name, to distance himself from their reputation. Hawthorne and his family, though, still lived in Salem. His wife Sophia suffered from migraines, and they took nightly walks around Old Burial Point. Their walks were said to give inspiration to Hawthorne for his writing. Maybe his ancestor wasn't too happy with his choice in differentiating his last name, and overheard Sophia and Nathaniel's talks, which might have led him to attempt to reach out or be seen. Judge Hawthorne is rumored to haunt the grounds at night, appearing in photographs by visitors near his grave, or as a dark apparition to the eye. Nearby is Judge Bartholomew Gedney, another well-known appointed judge in the witch trials. He personally was a good friend and acquaintance of one of the men accused of witchcraft, Captain John Alden. Beyond friendship, they had also been shipmates at sea. Gedney was supposedly conflicted with the accusations against the captain, but he doubted his honesty if he was in league with the devil when questioning him in court. It was believed the accused could lie and not be honest in their testimonies as they turned their back on God. Each time Alden looked at his accusers in the room, the inflicted girls found down in fits. Alden then questioned Gedney why he wasn't succumbing to fits or falling down when looking at him, like the others. But the judge remained silent. Captain Alden's case shows us how the witch hysteria was starting to appear to be more formed of false accusations and created fits, not from witchcraft but from just preteen girls. Luckily for Alden, after being taken into custody and being sent to Boston, he escaped a few months later. His tale, although tragic in many ways, was more fortunate than others accused. Both Hawthorne and Gedney at one point partook in witchcraft while questioning a slave who claimed to be a witch. They experimented with the methods she claimed to use on her victims, yet somehow both men weren't seen violating the law regardless of their actions. It's also worth noting slaves who were tried for witchcraft were ordered by their employers to confess to the crime, and not all given fair trials. Gedney did sit on many of the Salem witch trial cases, but also saw normal court cases during the height of the witch hysteria. Hawthorne and Gedney were part of an emergency court, the Special Court of Oil and Turmeric, meaning to hear and decide for the witch trials. Gedney and Hawthorne were just two of the judges on a panel of many during the trials. The witch trials ended when they were placed on hold from complaints to the system from the citizens of Salem. When the cases were allowed to be tried again, spectral evidence was no longer allowed. This evidence was mainly used on the cases prior for a guilty conviction. With no other evidence and a lack of solid cases, this put an end to the trials in the emergency court. The burial ground is filled with other notable prominent members of the Salem community during the trials, but also other few residents from history, pointing out the last governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, Simon Bradstreet, Chief Justice Benjamin Lynn, who oversaw the Boston Massacre trial, and Captain Roger Moore, passenger of the Mayflower, who was just 6 years old on the journey, are all buried within. Charter Street Cemetery has beautifully aged headstones, carved with heads of wings symbolizing the soul leaving the body, an early British colonial speech inscribed to the souls laid to rest. It makes a picture-perfect cemetery worth strolling on a fall day. Yet many of the homes or businesses surrounding the grounds claim they're visited by past residents of Charter Street. Apparitions in a nearby bar of a Victorian woman and a child as tourists enjoy lunch while touring Salem are very common. It's also speculated that some of the nearby buildings are built on graves or remains from the cemetery. A coffin was found in the same nearby bar during remodeling, which, as you can imagine, contributes to the stories and hauntings of Salem. Some visitors while walking the grounds have experienced a heavy feeling of depression when walking among the graves, as if there's little hope to be found in the world, deep in sadness and despair. Another resident we haven't mentioned yet is Mary Bright Corey, the second late wife of Corey Gills. Gills is the infamous so-called witch who was pressed to death in the witch trials. Why, though, was he the only one? He refused sentencing and wouldn't accept the charges of witchcraft against him, remaining silent the entire time. According to British law back then, if a subject refused sentencing, they were pressed to death. Gills died from the pressure just 8 years after Mary's passing. She is rumored to haunt Charter Street, appearing as an apparition in the back corner of the cemetery. Mary is seen wearing a blue powder dress while holding a picnic basket in hand, and sometimes seen with a young boy, believed to be her son. Both had passed away from a fire. Some believes the sightings of a lady in white seen around Charter Street also might be Mary. The lady in white is very elusive and camera shy, so it's hard to say for sure. It's speculated that the Irish immigrants who are buried on the outskirts of the cemetery where the sightings happen might be the lady in white instead. The separation of the Irish from the main cemetery's consecrated land from being Catholic was still a very common practice at this time. Sometimes unsuspecting tourists catch more than they bargained for on their visit, happily snapping photos inside the grounds. They then discover disturbing hauntings in their photography afterward. Heads picking up from graves, dark shadows, and some images tourists can't even speak of haunt their photos. The ghost tours during the fall season showing the grounds have spooked their share of Salem tourists, more than some care to admit. Apparitions, orbs, EVPs, light white mists, and mysterious shadows have all been reported. Some say it's possible Charter Street is one of the most haunted places in Salem, or possibly the East Coast. The exchange of family plots where remains were removed from graves and discarded elsewhere adds to the lore. Misfortune or falling on hard times could cause the sale of family plots to other families or a lack of descendants. I know myself and I think others think of graves as a once buried forever type of situation. So it's a weird, macabre part of history that removal occurred that isn't spoken of often. I personally find it weird how often graves were recycled or reused in history, or remains discarded like ordinary objects when you learn about the history of graveyards. Salem's Charter Street Cemetery was no different, which has visitors and locals both wondering, do the walls of Charter Street even matter, or really end as we see them today? Every inch of Salem is filled with as much history as Old Bearing Point. It's all tied together, woven into tales of witches and colonization in American history. Movies, books, and tales of the witches in Salem are now part of the essence of American culture. Cult favorites Hocus Pocus or Practical Magic are great examples of movies dipping into the folklores of Salem, turning witches into bedtime stories for All Hallows Eve, or intriguing tales for the young at heart. Book classics such as Nathaniel Hawthorne's The House of the Seven Gables and Arthur Miller's The Crucibles, ideals and inspirations came from these very tragic tales. The Nurse family did fight Rebecca's verdict for many years after 1692. The Nurse family was a prominent one in Salem Village community. She was the first victim to be absolved of the trials in the late 1700s. Her family had a stone memorial built in her honor in Salem Village, which is now modern-day Danvers, Massachusetts. Shockingly, it wasn't until the 1950s that the state of Massachusetts overturned the original rulings absolving 6 of the victims. This set a course of events for all eventually to be absolved. But for the hundreds of years, how much forgiveness can be in an overturn of rulings so long ago? The memorial to the Salem Witch Trial victims, just yards away from the prosecutors who sealed their grim fate hundreds of years ago, make Charter Street Cemetery a unique visit. It gives us pause and a history lesson of those gone before us in the middle of a lot of Halloween hocus pocus. But it also leaves visitors wondering, where does Charter Street Cemetery end? Or might there be a grave under the Memorial of Witches? What do you think? The grave grind for Charter Street Cemetery was a gingerbread latte from the recently opened coffee shop within Black Craft Cult on Essex Street. Please visit the-grim.com for more honorary grinds in the area. Salem is a local coffee shop haven for caffeine addicts. For now, we're closing the gate on Charter Street Cemetery. We hope you enjoyed our dig into history. If you did, subscribe today to join us next time when we open the gate on the Grim.